All right, hi. So I'm Muzammil, and this is my demo video. So for this demo video, we're actually going to be discussing a bit about pseudocode. So the things that we're going to be discussing about pseudocode is what pseudocode is, why do we really need pseudocode, what its purpose is, and what we can actually do with pseudocode, right? And because I'm assuming this is the first time you're learning about pseudocode, this is also the first time you're learning about programming. And pseudocode and programming actually go hand in hand, and we're going to explore how in just a minute. If you have any questions at any time, you could interrupt, you can like feel free to interrupt me and I'll answer them. And yeah, okay. So usually at this point in time, I would ask the student what they think pseudocode is based on the name itself. Of course, there's the word pseudo, which usually means something that's mimicking or replicating, and then there's code, which is what we actually write. And when we think about code, we think about instructions that we write to a computer. So effectively, what happens is that pseudocode is a way for us to plan about what we want to tell the computer or what instructions we actually want to write. So the thing is that we have various different programming languages. Some of them include, for example, Python, and one of them, which is very scary and something that I do at university, is C++. So there's this one concept, let's say there's this one concept called a loop. So in Python, the loop would look something like this. For I in range, let's say 0 to 10, and then the rest of the code would be over here, rest of the code. And in C++, the way we would write an instruction to do something 10 times or to write a loop would be something like this. For integer I less than 10, I plus plus, I plus plus, and then some curly brackets, the rest of the code here, the code or the thing that we want to do 10 times, and then curly brackets over here. So the idea over here is that these two pieces of code effectively do the same thing, but because they're in different programming languages, the way we would write this instruction that, okay, do this thing 10 times would be different, right? So pseudocode actually solves our problem by saying that instead of worrying too much on the syntax, right? So the way we write something, if for example, in a programming language is known as the syntax. So this would be the syntax of a for loop in Python, and this would be the syntax for a for loop in C++. They're different or they look different because the syntaxes are different, the grammar is different. So pseudocode says that instead of focusing that before you actually write down code on a programming language, instead of worrying about the syntax or the nitty-gritties or the peculiarities, why don't we just focus on the programming logic, right? So what happens is that pseudocode has a very simplified syntax. It's a very easy to understand thing, anybody can pick it up and they could probably like look at it at a glance and probably get some idea about what's going on, even if they don't really know any particular language. So pseudocode is free from all languages, it's free from any specific syntax, and it basically focuses on the programming logic. It focuses on what you want to get done and how you want to get done with it. The nitty-gritties about, oh, okay, we have to write it like this, or we have to write it like this would come much later. So pseudocode is actually the first step in actually writing down code. Do you have any questions at this point? At this point, I would ask for questions. And if you don't get questions and you generally understand what's going on or why we use pseudocode in the first place, I would then just continue. So continuing onwards, the idea here is that pseudocode basically allows us to plan our code or think about the instructions that we want to write. And this is where pseudocode and programming actually meet. So in pseudocode, we basically write non-programming language specific instructions in order to express how the program will flow. So for example, in pseudocode, or so every programming concept that you're going to be learning can be represented or written in pseudocode. So the first thing which we need to do whenever we start coding is we need to learn about how to declare variables, right? So if we want to talk about variables, so in pseudocode, I could write something like this, a, and I can assign it a value 5. So a is effectively a variable or a container that contains the value 5, right? So I can also access the value that's inside a. So if I write a program where I assign 5 to a, and then I use a print statement and I print a, then on my display, so if I run this code, if I write it in some programming language and then I run it, then on my screen, it should display 5, which is the value that's stored inside A. Likewise, so variables are essentially any, you know, it's basically a storage unit, or it's basically memory. So if you want your program to handle data, you want to store that data somewhere, and that data basically gets stored in variables. So here I'm giving it a value, so every time I run this program, a will always be given the value 5, and then that whatever is inside a, in this case 5, that would get printed out. But what if I wanted to take input from the user? So then there's a question about input. So in this case, I could have even because the thing is that if I want to take input from a user, then whatever the user enters needs to be stored somewhere. So I could do it like this in pseudocode. I can do a arrow. So arrow means that whatever is on the right-hand side gets put into whatever is on the left-hand side. So I can do a arrow input, and then I can print a. So in this case, what happens is that if and before that, because I'm taking input, I can also write a print statement that says, please enter a value. Please enter a value, right? So if I run this code, what's going to happen is that it's going to say, please enter a value, and then I can enter a value, let's say 7. So then when I enter 7, that data of 7 gets put into A, and now A is storing that data. So when I print A, it's going to print a 7 on my screen once again, right? So this is how you would, for example, declare a variable in Python, or well, not Python, a variable in pseudocode, and this is how you would print it out. And likewise here, if you want to print anything out on the screen, for example, hello world, you can just do print, and then you can write the message here. And then you can take input like this. And if you want to, for example, again, if you want to display whatever is contained in A, you can just simply print out A as itself, and whatever A is containing, that's going to be then displayed on the screen. Right? Any questions so far? If not, then I can give you a small question, but I think before that, we can also talk a bit about how there's different types of variables, right? So when you think about variables, there's a few different types, right? You can have, for example, variables that store integers. These are like whole numbers, right? So like 1, 2, 3, 1 million, 1 billion, 1,575,000 for some reason. So yeah, so variables can store integers, so those are number values. They can also contain strings, which are basically messages, right? So if I enter hello, or if I take my input as hello, then that would be a string input. So those are like sentences or words. Variables can also store characters. They can also store, they can store integers, strings, characters, Booleans. Booleans are like true and false. We'll look into those a little later as well, right? So the thing is that if we have two variables that are integers, we can actually perform certain operations in them. So for instance, I could say that, okay, let's assign A the value 5. Let's assign B, or let's give B a new variable, the value 6. And let's assign C the value of A plus B, right? And then let me print out C. So if I run this piece of code, what do you expect my output's going to be? If you thought, or if you said that my output's going to be 11, then you would be absolutely correct. That's because when we look at this statement, whatever is in A is being added to whatever is in B, because A contains the value 5 and B contains the value 6. Those then get added to the value 11, which is then put into C. And then I want to print out C, so the value 11 will be displayed on my screen. I could give you, if you have any questions, let me know. I can give you a minute to like take all this in. Just go through these, and then I'll give you a slightly interesting question that combines most of these concepts that we've discussed. So far, the only things that we've discussed is how to declare a variable. We said that we can declare a variable while assigning its value. Either we could be assigning it a value. For example, here we're assigning it 5, so it will always be assigned the value 5, or the user could be giving the variable a value. In that case, we'll be using input. And then we talked about how we can print both messages and how we can print the values that's stored into the variable. So that's 4 things. You can take some time, look through it, tell me if there's any problems, and then we can proceed. Also, since this is the demo, I don't really think I should just immediately proceed. But at this point in time, I would then let the student observe this, ask questions, and then we proceed on. So it's a slightly challenging question, but I could say using pseudocode, because remember, I want to reiterate as well that the entire point of pseudocode is to communicate and not worry too much about the syntax or the rules, right? So using pseudocode, take an input, or take a number input, OneNote isn't working very well. Take a number, or take 2 numbers, actually, it shouldn't be 8, it should be 2. So take 2 numbers as input. So take 2 numbers as input and print out their product, right? So you can help me come up with a solution to this. I can scroll up at any time you want. So ideally, so you can help me figure this out. What should we do? So the idea here is that we have to take 2 numbers as input, right? And over here, if you look at this, we took a number as an input over here, and we displayed that number. So to take 2, we would need 2 variables. So let's say we have variable A that's taking in some input from the user, right? So the user is entering some number, that number is being stored in A. We can also prompt the user. So in fact, a good programming practice would be to tell the user what they need to do so that they don't run our program and are just wondering why nothing's working. So, we can print a message for them. So we can say, please enter the first number, right? And then what we can do is we can then declare a variable, and this variable will take on whatever value the user now enters. So we can do input, right? And then we can prompt the user, or we can give another message. So as soon as the user enters the first number, we can then give them a message to then give me the second number, right? So then we can do print, please enter the second number. Yeah, so we can then print, please enter the second number. And we can then tell the user, and then so the user will be told to enter the second number, and we can then take input from the user. So whatever they enter will be captured by input and then given to B, right? And then we can create some variable C that does A times B, right? Because we're looking at the product. So whatever the user enters, that gets captured by A. Whatever the user enters the second time will get captured by B. We'll then take their product, and whatever the result is of the multiplication, we capture that, or we put that into C, right? And then we can simply print out C. So we can just do print C, right? So in this case, what do you think my output on the screen would be? It would be, please enter the first number. Let's say I enter the value 5, and then it would say, please enter the second number, and I could enter the value, let's say 7, right? So then what do you think the next line will be printed? What do you think the contents of the next line would be? Yeah, it would be. Okay, that was such a Dora the Explorer moment. But yeah, that would be 5 times 7, which I believe is 35. It should be 35, which it is 35. So then it should print out 35. Later on as well, if we're doing like, for example, Python code, or I believe the O levels also has Python code in it. So if we're doing Python, then you can actually write these, so you can translate these from pseudocode into Python specific grammar and Python specific syntax. And then you can actually run it, and then you would actually see all of this happening. But the main point about pseudocode is that here we weren't really worried about, in Python, you have to worry a lot about white spaces and indentations, and in C++, you have to like worry a lot about semicolons. Like after every statement in like C++, you have to put like a semicolon. But in pseudocode, what happens is that we're not too worried about the syntax. We just want the logic to be represented, and we want to communicate that logic. So I think the 15 minutes are almost up. And this is how I would also generally conclude my classes, is I'll give you a small summary. So to begin, so at the very start, we discussed what pseudocode is and why we use it. We kind of understood that different programming languages have different syntaxes or different grammars or different ways of doing the same thing. So in Python, you would write a for loop like this, and in C++, you would write it like this. But in pseudocode, what happens is that we don't want to focus too much on the syntax or in the way of writing something, but we want to focus more on the logic and the instructions that we want to give, right? So we basically, in pseudocode, we try to simplify the syntax as much, and it's something that we write for ourselves as programmers before we actually write an actual program in the programming language. So it really helps in like the planning steps. So in pseudocode, we first learned about variables. We learned about how to declare a variable and assign a value to it. So either we can hard code and assign a value by ourselves, or we could use the input function to take a input from the user and assign that. We learned about how to print messages using pseudocode and how to print the value stored in the variable. Apart from that, we kind of touched upon the different types of variables, and we learned about that how integer variables can actually be added together the same way you add numbers, and how, this question where we actually multiplied two integer inputs together to find their product. So yeah, so these are just some basic level programs. Hopefully it wasn't too overwhelming. But yeah, if you have any more questions or anything, just let me know. And I think next class, usually I hint at next class. So next class, I'll probably give you a very simple question similar to this, and we'll discuss a bit more. So there's a few other programming structures that we would then be discussing. Those include like if conditions and for loops, and then later on functions and stuff like that. Also different types, we'll talk about string handling, we'll talk about booleans and chars as we like move on with pseudocode. But this is us exploring or entering the surface, and yeah, so I'll see you later and have a great day.